and their different roles were cut off from each other and related only within the marketplace. So another way of looking at this structure, right, would be to create a biconditional. Another way of looking at this structure is to look at it before. Instead of connecting to the individual, I now connect to the system of capitalism, right? And that system of capitalism connects to other individuals. Therefore, my connection to other individuals is facilitated by my connection to global capitalism. So that the transformation of this is facilitated by a recognition that these two concepts are basically the same, visually the same. We recognize that dollar sign is a representation of sort of the economic marketplace at whatever time. At this time, it might have been industrialization at the time. Now it's global capitalism, and obviously global capitalism is fueled by information exchange, technological exchange, migration, mobility. These are sort of the seminal concepts that we need to understand in order to make sense of global capitalism. So this is the transformation, right? This is the transformation. Just a quick side note before we go on. This system is in itself being transformed as well, right? I'm not going to get into that because that has nothing to do necessarily with human rights. It comes more into a socio-political discourse. But the economic system and the economic manifestation properly of globalization is itself now transforming. And I did a video on Bitcoins and Bitcoin currency, cryptocurrency. I didn't just do that just as a try to be a fad and get some views, right? Nothing that I do on this channel is arbitrary. Everything that I do on this channel has been thought through systematically for, in some cases, months, right? So I'm not going to get into any detail, but the reason why I did the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency video particularly pertains to an attempt to try and let you guys, I'm not going to do it, right? To try and let you guys recognize that there is a sense in which the 21st century manifestation of globalization isn't just going to be sort of the infusion of global capitalism within remote indigenous communities and underdeveloped and developing countries, but the very nature of the system itself, the idea of encrypted currency and how that might unfold, the regulations, the transference, whether or not the dollar or bills are viable, all of that now surfaces. It's no longer sci-fi stuff anymore. It's a discourse that we need to be having, right? So, which leads to the next point in point D, which is 3D. In 3D, globalization is considered to be the second great transformation, right? So that when we talk about globalization, we say that globalization is now the second great transformation, right? And my sort of 2 cents is that this great transformation, globalization, will have many instantiations, many various manifestations in the next century, right? I think that the way in which global capitalism will manifest is going to vary based on accessibility to resources, the resistance that's met within indigenous and developed nations, and so on, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds within the 21st century, but you can rest assured that as it unfolds, the discourse on human rights and human rights violations is going to be very prevalent, and it's going to increasingly come further and further to the foreground, right? So we'll see exactly how that goes. As an expectation of the global marketplace, 2, it results in the experience of what is known as an avalanche of social dislocation. I love that line, right? An avalanche of social dislocation. Remember, we said in the beginning in the quote from Malcolm Waters, right, to start this, that there's an inverse relationship between the rise of globalization on the one hand, global capitalism on the other hand, so that as we increase global capitalism throughout the world as the sole and dominant governing market for business and economic exchange, it results in a dislocation of sociocultural arrangements, right? So that globalization increase results, for some, in a dislocated, such a great word, dislocated sociocultural, C-U-L-T, arrangements. Right? The increase of globalization results in a dislocated sociocultural arrangement. Right? Individuals are dislocated. What are they dislocated from? They're dislocated from other people. You're dislocated from, there's a lot of different ways that you can understand this. One way might be, and I could have broken this down a little bit more, but I don't want to get too deep. One way you can be dislocated is morally. You can become dislocated from the concerns of others. That's known as apathy, right? You become socially, culturally apathetic to the plight of others. Another way that you might be dislocated is in the increasing disparity of wealth. As the developed nation's middle class shrinks, right, there's an increasing disparity between those who have and those who don't, which is known as the haves and the have-nots. Insofar as there's this increasing disparity between those that have and those that do not have, there's going to be an increasing sense in which I, individual, middle-class John Doe, am going to be dislocated from the concerns of my fellow middle-classers because I recognize my vulnerability in becoming impoverished. So, insofar as that vulnerability increases, it's going to excite anxiety within me, and I'm a conflict resolutionist. I do this for a living. It's invariable that violence is going to escalate. There's no question about it, right? There's going to be an escalation of violence, an escalation of domestic abuse, an escalation of drug abuse and drug trafficking as the middle class recedes, right? Why? Because people will become more and more desperate in order to sort of maintain what they used to have. This is all sort of prospect theory based, right? Being risk averse and so on, right? It's harder for conceptual, and there's tons of research, and I've already done lecture series on this, but it's harder for someone to embrace the thought of losing what they already have, right? Rather than risking gaining something new. If I already have it, it's and this has been proven scientifically, it's harder for individuals to come to terms with the loss of something I already had. So insofar as there's a threat to that thing being the middle class through the expanse of globalization into the developing world, I am going to do whatever is within my power, both legally, illegally, morally, immorally, to maintain the thing I already have, which will result in the rise of violence and crime and so on and so forth, right? So it's very easy to see how social interaction becomes dislocated, which is a phenomenal word, right? With respect to apathy, with respect to violence, with respect to recognition, and so on. Many different ways you can articulate that. 3, at the bottom of page 6. At the bottom of page 6, the avalanche of social dislocation is 1, the feeling that no one cares, apathy. 2, that no one is there to help you, dislocation, isolation, angst. 3, then no one knows who you are, right? Alienation, right? So the idea of alienation, the idea of isolation, the idea of apathetic human relation, all of these arguably are consequences from the increase in global capitalism. Now that's a huge charge, right? That's a huge claim to launch against globalization as the prevailing isolated economic structure. And in defense of that, not that I need to defend it or not, in defense of that, we also have to look at what global capitalism, is doing for the class system and those impoverished individuals in the developing world. It's not fair to just look at the social dislocation in terms of those within, because this notion presumes that we're talking about developed nations. In developing nations, it's just the opposite, some would argue. That, no, what globalization is actually doing is that it's increasing social arrangements. It's minimizing social dislocation.